The first thing you notice about a ghost town isn't the silence, it's the sound. The way the wind whistles through a missing pane of glass, sounding for all the world like a woman crying. The creak of a saloon sign, swinging on a single rusted hinge, counting down the seconds to a gunfight that happened 100 years ago. This story starts in a town that wasn't dead yet, but it was dying. And it starts with a woman who might as well have been a ghost herself. Her name was Mercy Wickham, and she stepped off that stagecoach into the red dust of Siltwater Ridge like she was stepping into her own grave. She carried one bag, a canvas satchel stitched by her own hand, its straps worn smooth by years of running. The town didn't stop to look, but it noticed. You better believe it noticed. Eyes peeked through curtains. A gambler on the saloon porch paused with his pipe halfway to his lips, a slow smirk spreading across his face. "New hire for the marshal, I reckon," someone muttered. The wind snatched the words and buried them in the dirt. But secrets in a town like this don't stay buried for long. Mercy stood there, letting the town size her up. Her face was a mask, carved from prairie dust and hard times. But her eyes were a different story. They were pale green, washed out like an old photograph, and they darted everywhere, taking in every shadow, every rooftop, every escape route. She moved with the caution of an animal that knows the feeling of a trap snapping shut. Then he arrived. Marshal Eli Boone. He rode up on a horse the color of dried blood, a tall, sun-cracked man who looked like he'd been carved from the same rock as the mesas. His badge was dusty, and folks said his heart was too. He didn't offer a greeting, just a nod. "Mrs. Wickham." "Yes," she said. Her voice was flat, no life in it, just air. "You're late." She lifted her chin, just a fraction, not defiance, just a spark of something that refused to be put out. The pass was snowed in. I came when I could. He didn't apologize, he just leaned down, his shadow falling over her, and snatched her bag. "Wagons round back. We'd best get moving. They get restless near supper." "They?" she asked, though she already knew. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, finally met hers. And for the first time, something flickered in them. Not anger, not pity, just a bone-deep exhaustion that she recognized all too well. "My children," he said. And the way he said it, you knew it wasn't a blessing. It was a sentence. They rode out of that dying town and into the wide, lonely prairie. His farm wasn't much. A squat little house hunched against the wind, a windmill spinning like a broken promise. The ad she'd answered had been short on poetry. 5 children, all under 10. Mother gone 3 winters. Need a cook. Firm, but kind. It had left out the most important part. It had left out the smell of grief that clung to the place like wood smoke. The youngest, a little girl with wild curls and no shoes, met them at the gate. She held a stick like a tiny sword and stared at Mercy with open suspicion. "That's May," Eli said, his voice rough. May said nothing. She just frowned, sizing Mercy up, trying to figure out what this strange woman had come to steal. Their food, their father, or what was left of their hearts. The inside of the house was worse. It wasn't just messy, it was unraveling, like a quilt someone had given up on stitching back together. Toys littered the floor like tiny landmines. Dishes were piled high, a monument to despair. And a smell hung in the air. Onions, stale coffee, and something sour and sweet, like milk left to turn. The other children appeared one by one, like little ghosts. Addie, the oldest, with eyes that had seen too much. Micah, a thin, quiet boy who clung to his sister's shadow. Ruth, who clutched a doll with no arms. And Jonah, the boy with sticky fingers and a permanent scowl. They didn't greet her. They just watched. Their eyes followed her every move, cold and judging. "She's here to cook," Eli announced to the room. "Maybe more if you lot behave." But Mercy wasn't listening. Her gaze was fixed on the kitchen, where a pot of something had boiled over and scorched black to the stove. She didn't ask permission. She walked past all of them, tied on a dirty apron that wasn't hers, and rolled up her sleeves. Her movements were deliberate, efficient. Water went into a pot. Carrots were peeled with a sharp, steady hand. Flour dusted her arms like a fine layer of snow. The whole time, The children watched from the doorways, their whispers like the rustling of mice in the walls. She don't smile. She smells like rain and dust. Her hands look like daddy's. Eli stood outside, hammering a fence post. He wasn't watching, but he was listening. To every clang of a pot, to every whisper from his children. He was listening for the sound of his broken life finally shattering for good. That night, the dinner table was silent, but for the first time in a long time, it was full. The stew was thick and rich. The biscuits were so light they practically floated. No one said a word of thanks, but every bowl was scraped clean. Then Micah, the quiet one, looked straight at Mercy. "Mama's stew had less carrots," he said, his little voice cutting through the silence. The whole room froze. Eli looked like he'd been struck. Mercy didn't even flinch. She just held the boy's gaze and nodded. "Next time," she said softly, "we'll use fewer." It was a small thing, a tiny crack in the ice. But in that house, a crack was enough to let the light in, or so she thought, because as Mercy lay in her small, cold bed that night, listening to the wind howl outside, she clutched something hidden in her palm, something she'd carried with her all the way from the life she'd left behind. It was a man's silver locket, heavy, cold, and inside there wasn't a picture of a dead husband. There was a single, intricately folded piece of paper, a map. Mercy wasn't just here to cook. She was here for something else entirely, something buried right under this very farm. And she was willing to do whatever it took to get it, even if it meant pretending to care for a broken man and his 5 grieving children. The game had just begun. The next morning the town came calling, or rather the town's self-appointed conscience did. Her name was Mrs. Letty Caldwell, the church deacon's wife, a woman whose smile never quite reached her cold, calculating eyes. She arrived with a freshly baked apple pie and a warning wrapped in fake sweetness. "I'm sure you're a decent woman, Mrs. Wickham," she said, her eyes sweeping over the threadbare kitchen. "But a single woman, living under the marshal's roof, with his young, impressionable children? Well, tongues will wag. It's only proper you understand your place." Mercy took the pie. She didn't thank her. She just placed it on a high shelf, far out of reach, as if it were poison. Her face, which had been a quiet mask of indifference, now hardened into something else. Flint, hard, cold, and capable of making a spark. The whispers started small, a sideways glance at the general store, the clerk hesitating before bagging her sugar. "Put it on the marshal's tab?" he asked. "No," Mercy said, her voice clear and sharp. She placed her own coins on the counter. "My coin." The clerk's eyes widened. This woman wasn't a charity case. She wasn't just some hired help. She was something else. And that scared them more than any gossip ever could. The house, though, was slowly changing. Not because of any grand gestures, but because of 1,000 tiny, unseen moments. When Addie, the oldest, shoved her sister Ruth in a fit of anger, Mercy didn't shout. She simply separated them, then later found Addie alone and taught her how to stitch a patch onto a torn shirt. "It's better to mend things than to tear them further," she'd said, her eyes looking at something far away. When Jonah threw a tantrum, Mercy didn't scold him. She waited until he was done, then quietly handed him a wet cloth to wipe his own tears. She was teaching them something they'd forgotten, self-reliance, strength. But it was Micah, the quiet artist, who broke through her defenses first. He started leaving his charcoal drawings on the kitchen table for her to find. Sketches of horses, of the windmill, of his sisters. One morning she found a drawing of a woman with pale eyes standing over a stove. Underneath, in shaky letters, he'd written, "Miss Mercy." By the end of the week, they all called her that, all except May, the youngest, who still watched her with that unnerving, silent suspicion. One evening, Eli found Mercy on the porch, mending one of his shirts by the fading light. The stars were beginning to pop out of the bruised purple sky. "They're taking to you," he said, his voice a low rumble. She didn't look up from her needlework. "Children are like stray dogs. They'll follow anyone who feeds them and shows them a kind hand." "It's more than that," he insisted, stepping closer. He leaned against the porch rail, the wood groaning under his weight. "There's a quiet in the house I haven't heard since—" He trailed off, unable to say the name. His late wife's name. Sarah. Mercy finally paused, her needle hovering over the cloth. She looked up at him, her pale green eyes seeming to glow in the twilight. What happened to her, Marshall? The question hung in the air between them, sharp and dangerous. Eli stiffened. His folksy, broken man act disappeared, replaced by the cold, hard stare of a lawman. She's gone, he said, his voice flat. People don't just go, Mercy pressed, her voice just as cold. What are you not telling me? He stared at her for a long moment, the silence stretching until it was thin enough to snap. He was trying to read her, trying to see past the quiet cook to whatever lay beneath. But her face was a locked door. My wife, he said slowly, his voice laced with venom, was a good woman, a better woman than this town deserved. She got sick, a fever. It took her fast. It was a lie, a clean, simple, well-rehearsed lie. And Mercy knew it. She'd seen enough liars in her time to recognize one on sight. Marshall Eli Boone was hiding something big, something dark, and it had everything to do with his dead wife. Suddenly, the children weren't just grieving. They were potential witnesses. The messy, unraveling house wasn't just a sign of a widower's despair. It was the sign of a man trying to cover his tracks. Later that night, long after the house was asleep, Mercy slipped out of her room. The silver locket was warm in her hand. The map inside felt like it was burning a hole in her palm. She moved silently through the dark house, every creak of the floorboards a potential betrayal. She wasn't heading for the cellar or the barn, where a man might bury gold. She was heading for the one room in the house that was always kept locked. The room at the end of the hall. The room that had belonged to Sarah. She picked the lock with a hairpin, a skill she'd learned out of necessity a long time ago. The door swung open with a low groan. The room was just as she'd imagined, covered in dust cloths like a tomb. A dusty cradle sat in the corner, a silent accusation. But Mercy wasn't interested in the furniture. She went straight to the closet. Behind a row of faded dresses, she ran her hand along the back wall. Her fingers searched for a loose board, a hidden seam, and then she found it. A section of the wall that felt different. Hollow. She pried at it with her fingers, her heart hammering in her chest. It came away with a soft scraping sound, revealing a small, dark cavity. Inside was a metal box. This was it. This had to be it. The stash her husband had told her about. The money from the last job, the one that had gotten him killed. He'd told her his partner, a man he only knew as the marshal, had hidden it. He'd said the man had a farm, 5 kids. It had to be Boone. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the heavy box. She didn't have a key, but she didn't need one. She carried it back to her room, her mind racing. She would take the money and be gone before sunrise. Gone from this house of ghosts, gone from this lying marshal and his sad-eyed children. She used the butt of her small hidden pistol to break the lock. It sprang open, but inside there wasn't money. There were no stacks of gold coins or crisp banknotes. There was only a single worn leather journal and a stack of letters, tied with a black ribbon. Letters written in a frantic, elegant hand. Letters from Sarah Boone. And as Mercy read the first line of the top letter, her blood ran cold. My dearest Letty, it began. If you are reading this, then Eli has killed me. The storm came out of nowhere. One minute, the sky was a placid blue. The next, it was the color of a fresh bruise. The wind screamed down from the ridge, tearing at the house, rattling the windows in their frames. It was as if the world itself was trying to claw its way inside. And inside, Mercy felt a storm of her own brewing. She sat on her cot, the metal box open in her lap, Sarah Boone's journal staring up at her. Eli has killed me. The words echoed in her mind, a ghostly whisper that chilled her to the bone. This changed everything. Eli wasn't just a liar. He was a murderer, a cold-blooded killer hiding behind a dusty badge and 5 grieving children. Her own quest for the stolen money seemed insignificant now, a fool's errand. She was trapped in a killer's house. Her first instinct was to run, to grab her satchel and disappear into the storm, let the wind and the rain swallow her whole. But then she thought of the children, Addie with her old soul eyes, Micah and his silent drawings, Jonah and his angry fists, Ruth and her armless doll, little May and her suspicious frown. They weren't just witnesses. They were the children of a monster. What would happen to them if she left? What had they already seen? The front door slammed open, and Eli strode in, bringing the wind and the rain with him. He looked wild, his hair plastered to his forehead, his eyes dark and stormy. "The creek's rising," he announced, his voice tight. "Addie, Micah, get the buckets. Jonah, you and Ruth check the windows." The children scrambled to obey, their fear of the storm momentarily overriding their fear of him. Eli's eyes found Mercy, who was still sitting frozen in her room, the open box just out of his line of sight. "Mrs. Wickham, I need you to keep the little ones calm." She wanted to scream. She wanted to point a trembling finger and call him a murderer, but she couldn't. Not yet. To show her hand now would be a death sentence. She had to play the part. The quiet, capable cook. She forced herself to stand, to slide the box under her cot with her foot. She walked out into the main room, her legs feeling like lead. She gathered May and Ruth, who were starting to cry, and began to hum a soft, low tune. A song her own mother used to sing, about a ship lost at sea. As she hummed, she watched him. She watched the way he moved, the way he gave orders. There was no panic in him, just a cold, hard efficiency, the same efficiency a man might use to dig a grave. The storm raged for hours. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the room in brief, terrifying flashes. In one of those flashes, Mercy saw something that made her heart stop. Eli was standing by the fireplace, his back to her, looking at the family portrait on the mantel. It was a faded photograph of him, a much younger Sarah, and a baby Addie. His hand was clenched into a fist at his side, but it was his face that terrified her. In that split second of lightning, she saw no grief, no sadness. She saw pure, unadulterated rage. The next day, the storm had passed, leaving a clean, rain-washed world in its wake. But the tension inside the house was thicker than mud. Eli was distant, his silence a heavy, menacing weight. Mercy moved through her chores on autopilot, her mind racing, trying to piece together a plan. She had to get the journal out of the house. She had to get it to someone. But who? The town was already suspicious of her. Letty Caldwell, Sarah's sister, seemed the obvious choice, but approaching her would be risky. The opportunity came unexpectedly. Eli announced he had to ride out to check on a neighbor whose barn had been damaged in the storm. "I'll be gone most of the day," he said, his eyes lingering on Mercy for a moment too long. "Keep the children close to the house." It wasn't a request. It was an order, a threat. The moment his horse disappeared over the rise, Mercy moved. She told Addie she was going to the creek to fetch fresh water, a plausible excuse. She wrapped the journal in oilcloth and tucked it deep inside her dress, the book pressing cold against her skin. She didn't go to the creek. She cut across the fields, her boots sinking into the wet earth, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of Eli's return. The walk to town felt like 100 miles. Every rustle in the grass sounded like footsteps behind her. When she reached Letty Caldwell's house, a neat white-painted home with a picket fence choking on roses, her nerve almost failed her. What if Letty was in on it? What if this was all some elaborate trap? But the words from the journal spurred her on. "My dearest Letty," Sarah had trusted her sister. Mercy had to do the same. Letty opened the door, her face a mask of surprise that quickly hardened into suspicion when she saw who it was. "Mrs. Wickham, what on earth are you doing here?" "I need to speak with you," Mercy said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "It's about your sister." She pushed past the startled woman into the parlor, her hands trembling as she pulled the journal from her dress. "I found this, hidden in her room." Letty took the journal, her eyes wide. She sank onto a velvet settee, her fingers tracing the faded initials on the cover. "S.B." She opened it, and a low gasp escaped her lips as she recognized the handwriting. Mercy watched as Letty's face shifted from disbelief to horror, then to a deep, gut-wrenching sorrow. Tears streamed down her cheeks, spotting the delicate pages. She looked up at Mercy, her eyes full of a terrible, newfound understanding. "I knew it," Letty whispered, her voice breaking. "I always knew something was wrong. He said it was a fever. But Sarah was never sick a day in her life. She was afraid of him. In the end, she was so so afraid. Suddenly, Letty's grief morphed into a steely resolve. He won't get away with this. The council respects my husband. We'll bring this to them. We'll see him hang for what he did. Just then, the front door creaked open. Both women froze. A man stepped into the room. He wasn't the deacon. He was a stranger, dressed in a dusty duster coat, with a cruel, thin-lipped smile and eyes as dead as a snake's. On his hip, he wore a gun, low-slung and well-oiled, and pinned to his chest was a tarnished silver badge. Not a marshal's star, a U.S. deputy's shield. "Well, well," the man said, his voice a gravelly drawl. He looked from the journal in Letty's hands to the terrified look on Mercy's face. "Looks like I'm interrupting a private party." He took a step forward, his spurs jingling ominously on the wooden floor. His dead eyes locked onto Mercy. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face, a smile of recognition. "Mercy Calloway," he hissed. "I've been looking for you for a very, very long time." The name hit the air and shattered the silence. Mercy Calloway. Letty Caldwell gasped, her eyes darting from the menacing lawman to the woman she thought was a simple cook. Wickham wasn't her name. It was a shield. A lie. "You're not who you said you were," Letty whispered, clutching the journal to her chest as if it could protect her. "Neither is anyone else in that godforsaken town," the deputy snarled, his eyes never leaving Mercy. "The name's Agent Flint, and I have a warrant for your arrest, Mercy, for accessory to murder and armed robbery." Mercy's blood ran cold. This couldn't be happening. She had run so far, buried herself so deep. "You're mistaken," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "My name is Wickham. I'm a widow." Flint let out a short, barking laugh. "Oh, you're a widow, all right. Your husband, Silas Calloway, bled out in a gutter in St. Louis after his one last job went south. But not before he gave up his partner's name. A man they called the Ghost. A man who disappeared with all the money. A man who, according to Silas, had a woman working with him on the inside. A woman who looked just like you." He took another step closer, his hand hovering over the butt of his pistol. "The bank teller who was shot during that robbery? He died 2 weeks ago. Now it's a murder charge. And Silas's dying words are going to put you and the Ghost on the gallows." Panic clawed at Mercy's throat. Silas, her foolish, handsome Silas, who had promised her a better life and delivered only death and misery. He had betrayed her, even in death. She had been a victim in that robbery, a pawn in his game. But Flint wouldn't see that. No one would. All they'd see was the outlaw's wife. "What does this have to do with Eli Boone?" Letty demanded, her fear making her bold. Flint's dead-eyed gaze shifted to her. "Everything," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You see, this Ghost was clever. He laundered the money, bought up land, built himself a respectable life, even became a town marshal, all while hiding a very dark secret about how his first wife really died." The implication hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Eli Boone, the marshal, the Ghost. It all clicked into place in Mercy's mind with sickening clarity. The stolen money she'd been searching for wasn't from some petty stash. It was the loot from the St. Louis bank. Eli wasn't just a wife killer. He was her husband's partner. The man who had orchestrated the robbery that had destroyed her life. The man who had left Silas to die. He had lured her here, to his home, with that advertisement. But why? To silence her? To find out what she knew? Before anyone could speak, the floorboards of the porch outside groaned. All three of them froze. The front door swung open, and there stood Eli Boone. He wasn't wearing his dusty farm clothes. He was dressed in black, a gun belt strapped to his waist, his face grim and set. His stormy eyes took in the scene in an instant. The terrified Letty clutching the journal, the menacing Agent Flint, and Mercy, pale and trembling, caught in the middle of it all. He looked directly at Mercy, and his voice was cold as a grave. "You should have stayed out of my wife's room." Flint grinned, a predator's smile. "Boone, or should I call you the Ghost? Fancy meeting you here. It saves me a trip." He drew his pistol with lightning speed. "You're under arrest, for robbery, and for the murder of Sarah Boone." Eli didn't even flinch. His hand didn't move toward his gun. He just shook his head slowly. You've got it all wrong, Flint. You always were 2 steps behind. And then, from behind Eli, 2 more figures emerged from the blinding sunlight. They were the children, Addie and Micah. But they weren't the scared, grieving children Mercy knew. Addie's face was hard, her eyes filled with a chilling resolve. And in her small hands she held an old heavy Colt revolver, and she was pointing it directly at Agent Flint. Micah stood beside her, his hands empty, but his expression was just as fierce. You're not taking him, Addie said, her voice small but steady as a rock. And you're not taking her. Everyone stared, stunned into silence. This wasn't a child playing with a toy. The look in her eyes was deadly serious. She knew how to use that gun. Addie, put that down, Eli said, his voice soft but firm, never taking his eyes off Flint. No, Daddy, she replied, her knuckles white on the grip. Not until he leaves. They're trying to break us apart again, just like before. Again, the word hung in the air. Flint just laughed, a sound that curdled the blood. You think a little girl with a gun scares me? You Boones are all the same, rotten to the core. But then Micah, silent Micah, finally spoke. His voice was a whisper, but it cut through the tension like a razor blade. She didn't get a fever, he said, looking at Letty Caldwell, his eyes welling up with tears he refused to let fall. And Daddy didn't hurt her. He took a shaky breath, and the next words he spoke brought the whole house of cards crashing down. It was Grandpa, he whispered. I saw him. He pushed her down the stairs. The confession hung in the room, more shocking than a gunshot. Grandpa. Letty Caldwell's face went white. What are you saying, Micah? Our father? He's been dead for 10 years. No, Eli said, his voice heavy with a grief that seemed ancient. He finally looked at Letty, his eyes full of a sorrow she couldn't comprehend. Your father, Judge Caldwell, faked his death a decade ago. He's been living out on the North Ridge, hiding. Sarah found out. She found out he was the one who hired Silas Calloway and my old partner for that bank job. She was going to expose him. Agent Flint's smug grin faltered. The judge? That's impossible. Is it? Eli shot back. Your entire investigation was based on the word of a dying outlaw and a corrupt judge who fed you lies from the beginning. He's been pulling your strings all along. He wanted the ghost share of the money, and he wanted me out of the way. He used Silas's death to frame me, and he used you, he nodded at Mercy, to be his pawn. He knew you'd come looking for the money. He knew you'd find the journal he planted. He set this whole thing up. It was a dizzying spiral of lies within lies. Judge Caldwell, Letty and Sarah's father, the man everyone thought was a dead saint, was the true monster. He had orchestrated the robbery, murdered his own daughter to keep her quiet, and framed Eli. He had manipulated everyone. He tried to make it look like I killed her, Eli continued, his voice cracking. He threatened the children. He told them if they ever said a word, he'd do the same to them. And to me, we've been living in this prison of fear for 3 years. Addie's hands trembled on the gun, but her aim stayed true. He said he'd come back for us. He said we belonged to him. The pieces all fell into place for Mercy. The children's fear, Eli's silence, the locked room. It wasn't a tomb. It was a memorial to a woman he couldn't save, and a constant, agonizing reminder of the secret he was forced to keep. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked upstairs. Every head snapped up. A shadow fell across the top of the staircase. An old man, stooped and frail, stepped into view. He looked harmless, like a grandfatherly ghost, but his eyes burned with a cold, terrifying fire. It was Judge Caldwell. He held a small, silver-plated derringer in his wrinkled hand, and it was aimed right at little May, who he held squirming in his other arm. That's enough family reunion for one day, the judge rasped, his voice like grinding stones. Drop the gun, Addie, my dear, or your little sister gets to see Mama again. The world seemed to shrink to the 4 walls of that parlor. Every breath was a gamble, every heartbeat a drumbeat, counting down to an explosion. Judge Caldwell stood at the top of the stairs, a monster wearing a grandfather's skin. Little May struggled in his grip, her small whimpers cutting through the thick silence. "You see," the judge said, his voice a dry, papery rustle, "this town was built on order. My order. Sarah, my own flesh and blood, threatened that. She had a foolish sense of morality, a weakness I could not abide." He looked down at Eli, his eyes glittering with a lifetime of venom. "And you, Marshall, you were a useful tool, a ghost I could command. But you grew a conscience, another weakness." "Let the child go, Caldwell," Agent Flint snarled, his pistol now trained on the old man. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He had been played for a fool, a puppet in a dead man's game. The judge just chuckled, a horrible, dry sound. "You're in no position to make demands, Agent. You're a loose end. As is this little thief," he sneered, nodding at Mercy. "My original plan was so much cleaner. Let the outlaw's wife and the disgraced lawman destroy each other. But you all had to dig." "It's over, Father," Letty cried, tears streaming down her face. "For God's sake, don't do this." "It was always for you, Letty Bird," he cooed, his voice sickeningly sweet. "To protect our family's name, our legacy." Eli took a slow step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Let May go. This is between you and me. It always has been." "It is," the judge agreed, "and it ends now." He tightened his grip on May, and the little girl cried out in pain. That was the spark. In that split second, everything happened at once. Addie, seeing her sister's pain, let out a cry of rage and pulled the trigger. The Colt boomed, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The shot went wide, splintering the banister next to the judge's head. The judge flinched, momentarily distracted. It was the only opening they would get. Mercy, acting on pure instinct, grabbed a heavy porcelain vase from a side table and hurled it at the judge. It shattered against his shoulder, making him stumble back. Eli lunged. He didn't go for his gun. He charged up the stairs, a human battering ram, his only thought to get between the madman and his child. Flint, seeing his chance, fired his own pistol. But he wasn't aiming at the judge. He was aiming at Eli. The bullet tore through Eli's shoulder, spinning him around. He cried out, stumbling but never stopping, his momentum carrying him forward. He crashed into the judge, a tangle of limbs in desperation. The derringer went off, the shot muffled against Eli's body. May screamed and tumbled free, rolling down the stairs into Letty's waiting arms. At the bottom of the stairs, Mercy didn't hesitate. Addie was fumbling to cock the heavy revolver again. Mercy grabbed it from her hands, the metal warm. She was a cook, a widow, a victim. But in that moment, she was something else. She was a survivor. She raised the heavy gun with both hands, aimed, and fired. The bullet hit Judge Caldwell square in the chest. His eyes went wide with shock, a look of pure disbelief on his ancient face. He staggered backward, clawed at the air, and then tumbled over the railing, landing in a crumpled heap on the parlor floor below. Dead. Silence. The only sounds were May's terrified sobs and the ragged, pained gasps of Eli, who was slumped against the wall at the top of the stairs. Blood spreading across his shirt. Agent Flint stood frozen, his gun smoking, his face a mixture of shock and dawning horror. He had shot a marshal. He had been a pawn. His career, his reputation was over. Mercy dropped the Colt, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She ran to the stairs to Eli, her heart hammering against her ribs. Addie and Micah were right behind her. "Daddy!" Addie cried, her tough facade crumbling into the tears of a terrified little girl. Eli grunted, forcing a weak smile. "Just a scratch," he rasped, though the growing stain of red on his shirt told a different story. His eyes found Mercy's, and in them she saw a million unspoken words. Gratitude, regret, and something else, something fragile and new that she didn't dare put a name to. The aftermath was a quiet, somber affair. Agent Flint, a broken man, helped carry Eli to the doctor. He gave a full report, omitting nothing, taking his share of the blame for being so thoroughly duped. The town was rocked by the scandal. The sainted Judge Caldwell was a monster, a murderer. The quiet, brooding marshal was a hero, a man who had suffered in silence to protect his children. And Mercy Wickham, or rather Mercy Calloway, was cleared of all charges. Flint's report, combined with Letty's testimony and the contents of Sarah's real journal, which they found hidden beneath a floorboard in the judge's abandoned cabin, painted her as what she was, a victim. A woman who had been used, first by a criminal husband and then by a master manipulator. They buried the judge in the corner of the cemetery, with no sermon and no mourners, save a weeping Letty. The town tried to apologize to Eli, to Mercy. Mrs. Caldwell brought another pie, this one offered with genuine, trembling hands. Mercy accepted it. The house on the prairie began to heal. The unraveling stopped. Slowly, stitch by painful stitch, a new tapestry was being woven. Eli's shoulder healed, leaving a jagged scar that he would carry forever. But the deeper scars, the ones on his soul, also began to fade, replaced by the light in his children's eyes. They no longer watched Mercy with suspicion. They clung to her. Jonah followed her everywhere. Ruth gave her the armless doll to mend. Addie helped her in the kitchen, her movements mirroring Mercy's. Micah filled pages with drawings of their new family. A tall man with a sling, a pale-eyed woman, and 5 children, all of them smiling. And little May, who had been pried from a madman's grip, now slept only if Mercy was the one to tuck her in. One evening, weeks later, Eli found Mercy on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. "The council offered me my badge back," he said, standing beside her. "Are you going to take it?" she asked, not looking at him. "No," he said. "I think I'm done being a ghost. I'm ready to be a father, a farmer." He paused and she could feel his gaze on her. A husband, maybe, if the right woman would have me. Mercy's heart skipped a beat. She finally turned to look at him. His face was no longer a mask of grief and secrets. It was open, honest, and full of a quiet, hopeful light. "You don't owe me anything, Eli," she whispered. "I know," he said, and he reached out, his rough hand gently taking hers. "This isn't about owing. This is about choosing. We were both brought to this place by lies and ghosts and stolen money. We were meant to destroy each other." He squeezed her hand. "But what if we were meant to build something instead? Something real?" Mercy looked from his hopeful face to the warm light spilling from the windows of the house behind them. She heard the sound of her children laughing inside. She thought of the long, lonely road that had brought her here, a road paved with pain and fear. It hadn't led her to a hidden treasure of gold. It had led her to something far more valuable. Home. She smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her pale green eyes and made them shine. "I think," she said softly, "I'm tired of running." And in the quiet of that prairie twilight, under a sky full of forgiving stars, 2 broken souls, a quiet hero and a runaway survivor, finally found their place. They had faced down the ghosts of the past and, against all odds, had chosen to build a future together. What do you think? Is it possible to find a real family in the most unexpected of places? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of twists, secrets, and the enduring power of hope, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the stories we have coming next.